I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from so that you'll know where the rest of my comments originate from. And so I did grow up in a small community, a logging community in Northwest Montana. The name of the town is Libby, as Kim said. And I'm actually a 4th generation Montanan. My daughter's a 5th generation Montanan, but I spent a lot of time living in actually 3 of the 4 states that you folks represent. My first teaching job was in Post Falls, Idaho, and I then returned to Montana, was a teacher for several years in a couple of different towns, Colstrip and Whitefish. And then I moved to Washington State, over in the Hoquiam, Aberdeen area, and I was a teacher there and then an educational specialist. And before I went to Boise State 14 years ago, I worked for quite a few years, almost 10 years, in the ESD that is located in Olympia. And that was a really fantastic experience. I know that some of the school districts actually in Washington that are on the list are in my own old ESD region. In that region, there were 45 school districts, and 40 of those school districts had fewer than 2,000 kids. There were about 200 schools. So I spent a lot of time, I grew up in a rural place and living in rural places. This is actually a picture of Libby. And let me just make sure I'm getting a little message here that make sure we're okay in terms of internet. So I understand completely that rural is more than a census definition. And today, the things that I talk to you about, I want you to know that I have contextualized those within, what I know about your context. And there are really 6 things, I have 2 kinds of things that I've studied at Boise State, and one is rural education and the other one is poverty, and a lot of times the 2 cross over. So it's important for us to understand that rural isn't one thing. A lot of America believes rural is one thing, but that's not true. Rural is, every community is different, and whatever you do and whatever you take out of this and however you plan and go forward will be uniquely yours. We recognize, I recognize that in rural communities, there is a strong interdependence between schools and their community, and that's not so true in suburban and urban areas. And also that you have a make-do attitude, that a lot of times in research, in grant funding, a lot of times in just general society, in urbanization, rural places have been marginalized, but somehow rural gets it done. You see it over and over in the places that I've worked. Some other things about rural that I think are important to contextualize is that one of the things that purposes of, local schools can often be contested in rural places, and sometimes it feels like we get policy that doesn't fit us. It comes from the state, it comes from the federal government, and when it trickles down to us, it doesn't quite fit us. I really see these unusual times, these unprecedented times as your chance to innovate. We're going to talk more about that later. And then specifically, some ways to think about innovating as you come back, some things that might be some silver lining things that we'll talk about it towards the end, is to stem the trend of outmigration, where maybe the quote best and brightest or the most highly educated leave rural communities and they don't come back. And also to teach kids to live well in their rural community should they choose to do so. This is another place I'm coming from. And so this is the other piece of what I have done in terms of my research agenda as a professor at Boise State. And that is to look at how schools and individual teachers disrupt the adverse impact of poverty. And I'm actually going to draw from some of these resources to talk to you today about, what they learned when schools closed, the lessons that might be valuable to you as you reopen, but also as you anticipate that you may have to reclose and go in and out of that. And I'll say more about that. These are the 2. The 2018 book is a study of classroom teachers across the country who were recommended to us as teachers who disrupt poverty. And the book on the right-hand side is a brand new release second initiative in high poverty. So I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute. So I want us to start thinking about, I know that when we got into the breakout rooms, one of the people that I met, he said that he's just anxious to get back to normal. I'm not sure we're ever going to get back to normal, and I suspect that when we go back, there's going to be a new normal. And in some ways, I think that's a good thing. There's a blessing here. A lot of the educators that my co-author and I interviewed, in part for this presentation, really spoke of wanting to create some new normals in their schools, and we'll talk more about that. But I want to start with this idea of self-care and the importance of self-care. And to do that, I want to show you a video. This is actually a partnership that Edutopia did with the Soul Pancake. And this was done a few years ago for teacher appreciation. But I think the message is really important for all of us who just kind of experienced this incredible change that was so sudden. So let's just take a look at this.
Feel the pressure.
Dear Lila.
Dear Joey.
Dear first year me.
Hola.
Hey kid.
Remember when Dad said that the first 6 months of anything is the hardest? Well, that is completely true here.
Everything is going to be okay. Things may seem tough right now, and at times you may feel like you want to give up, but please don't.
Just know that you'll make a great teacher.
You are probably wondering, why in the world did I ever get into this profession?
Just take a deep breath. I know that everything feels overwhelming, terrifying even, but you're gonna make it through this.
Those kids in front of you, they want to learn. They need to know. Try every crazy thing you think of. In the end, those are the things that they'll remember.
Your students need you there in front of the class, and they truly appreciate all that you do for them, even if they don't show it all of the time.
You'll have trouble the first day of school with a student throwing a book at you. It'll miss, but don't worry. That student will come back 5 years later, introduce you to his new family, and thank you for having his back all the time, even after that first day.
When a kid says your class is boring, don't take it personally. It happens to everyone.
Holding your kids accountable is the greatest act of love you can give them.
Teaching is never an exact science, and it's okay to struggle to find the answers.
This is one of the most important lessons to learn as a teacher. You will fail, you will make mistakes, and you will embarrass yourself. When you do, accept it with grace and humility.
And don't be afraid to ask for or admit you need help.
You will also learn that you never stop learning to become the teacher you wanted to be on day one. I want you to know that what you expected to happen on the first day of school won't happen until maybe the 3rd, 4th, or even 18th year of your teaching.
Lives and futures depend on you. That's scary and exhilarating.
And you will know that this is exactly where you need to be.
No matter what you might think, you are doing a good job. Through it all, the good and the bad, just trust yourself.
It's gonna be okay, and 7 years later, you're still gonna love coming to work every day.
So keep up the great work, seek help from those around you, and just know that the work of a teacher is of the greatest importance. Your future self.
Today, because I think a lot of educators that I had a chance to talk to in the last 2-3 months have really felt like first year teachers again in some ways. The change was so sudden, and if anything, there maybe is a blessing in all of this, that the importance of the work that you all do, has become very apparent, I think, to the communities you serve and the families and the parent communities. All that said, as you move forward and move into reopening your schools, and as I said, potentially having to close and go back and forth, the importance of self-care and grace is really important. So some of the things that these educators talked about, and also experts that, we went out and talked to people that were experts in rural education, as well as people that were experts in different topics that I will share with you today, like self-care and grace, said some important things that we need to just keep in mind. So this was a quick switch. And for a lot of us, it created a question of confidence and a question of efficacy, and to understand that that's normal. And we saw kids and probably heard from kids and families that were experiencing and still are experiencing a lot of trauma, sudden loss of jobs, a lot of things that the isolation of the quarantine times throughout the country. And that secondary trauma is bound to affect us as educators. And then I think one of the hardest changes, and this is actually a change that I noticed when I transitioned from my K-12 job to the university job, is that home became work and work became home. And that isn't always a good thing, because you feel like you're 24/7 on, and that's tough. Sometimes you have to be off. You don't want to be on all the time. So let's talk about what these educators, what their advice was. So they talked about the importance of doing those things that we're always told about, but sometimes it's just really hard to do them. Getting enough sleep, getting exercise, eating well, those things for our physical well-being. Maybe even beginning a practice, even if you haven't begun a practice, for your mental health, yoga, mindfulness, and then to stay connected in whatever ways you can, that the social connections are so important. I think one of the most important things that I heard was the idea of normalizing trial and error. So as we come back, and as if we have to leave again and close again, normalizing trial and error and making it safe is going to be an important piece of self-care and grace. Developing the habit of turning to wonder. I'm going to say more about families in a minute. In some of the schools that Bill and I work in that are not necessarily yet high-performing schools, there was a tendency to really blame. There was a lot of blaming that went on of kids and families. And I would ask for your own self, for your self-care, but also for the good of what you're going to be able to do when you come back. And if you have to go back, if you have to close again, is to develop the habit, when you start moving yourself into judgment, develop the habit to turn to wonder. Instead of saying, why is that person doing that? Or why did those parents not do this or that? Turn to wonderment instead of judgment, and ask yourself, I wonder why. Because that's really the sort of problem-solving orientation you're going to need. For yourself, unplug. Have an absolute time that you are unplugging from everything electronically. One school district that Bill and I studied in Canada did this before schools closed, and they continued it during the distance or emergency learning, as some have called it. No email calls to each other after 6 p.m. and no emails over the weekends or calls unless it's an emergency. That might seem drastic, but it was one of their ways of taking care of themselves. I'm going to move in now to some conversation about equity. We're really talking about three things today. So self-care, equity, and silver linings. And as I move into this piece, I want to share with you that something that I think is important as we design our new normal as we go back. And this is a piece that no matter if Bill and I are talking about equity alone or poverty and disrupting poverty, we start with this. So Parker Palmer, in his book, The Courage to Teach, makes a provocative statement that we have come to understand is key to building a commitment to equity and actually executing it. And this is what he says. He's in the United States to to improve our schools, the question that we most commonly ask is the what question. What standards should we set? What programs should we adopt? What schedules should we establish? He said when the conversation goes a bit deeper, we ask the how question, the pedagogical questions. We start talking about strategies. Occasionally, when it goes deeper still, we give teachers a chance to talk about the why question. And sometimes that why question is, why do we teach this or that? But at other times it's, why do we teach? Which is a really important question. But he said, seldom if ever do we ask the who question. And so as I begin talking about equity and what might be really important to be thinking about, who you are and who you bring to the classroom, to the school, to the State Department, to wherever you work, is the most important consideration when we talk about committing to equity. Now, I want to say a bit about the other question, the question of why, and the importance of the question of why. So the who question and the why question. What we know about self-care and what we know about grace and resiliency from the research is that one of the things that teachers who choose to teach in tough places to staff stay there because they tap into their why on a regular basis. Mark Twain said the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. So actually tapping into a moral purpose that's bigger than yourself with other people is actually builds resiliency and provides a protection for you as a teacher. So thinking about who you are as an educator, who you are as a teacher, who you are and why you do what you do are two important ideas as we move forward and talk about equity. So what I want to do is I want to give you now a minute to go to the chat, and if you would be willing to enter into the chat discussion, how are you taking care of yourself? How did you take care of yourself during the school closures? And how are you taking care of yourself as you think about moving back into maybe a face-to-face mode? So I'm going to just take a peek into the chat, and if you would take a few minutes, we probably won't take 3 minutes, but if you'll take a few minutes to do that, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to move forward. Thank you for all of that participation. So, rethinking equity. One of the things that you heard over and over, we heard it in the news, we heard it when educators talked, that when COVID-19 hit, and this isn't just a US phenomena, but it is a global phenomena, the inequities in our society and the inequities in our schools were magnified greatly. This is our opportunity to actually go back to school and double down on the inequities that we know exist in school, in schooling and school in general, and in your individual schools. So again, as I've said, committing to equity begins with us. I'd like to ask you to do a little activity now, and we probably will take a few minutes to do this, maybe not 3, but maybe 2 minutes. I would like you to either do the old-fashioned, take out a piece of paper and a pen, or open a Word doc and jot down, see if you can get 100 words down, jot down where your ideas about equity come from. Where do your ideas about equity come from? And I'm going to stop talking for a minute. If you just try to jot down 100 words. This 100-word reflection is actually a teaching technique that is used in teacher education in the UK. And it's a way of developing the habit of becoming reflective about our thinking and about our practice. So I'll be silent for a few minutes, and if you would just jot those ideas down, that would be great. Okay, we're going to take about 30 more seconds. So if you finish your last thought. Okay, so what we just did there was activate your mental map. In both of the books that Bill and I co-authored, all three of the books we co-authored, we talk about mental maps. This isn't our notion, it comes from other scholars. The idea that we all have a mental map that guides our thinking, our attitude, and our behavior. And we're talking about things like equity, poverty, race, racism. Our mental maps are important. So what is a mental map? A mental map is an image, an assumption, a story that we carry around in our minds that shape our behavior and our attitude. They are unconsciously held. So implicit bias is a part of our mental map. These are unconsciously held, and we rarely examine them unless we're asked to or put in some sort of situation where we have to. And the whammy for us as educators, as humans actually, is that they limit our ability to change. But there are some things that we know that if we're willing to interrogate our mental maps, and that's usually done in two different ways. If you're a school, what we have found in high-performing, high-poverty schools is that they interrogate their mental map through inquiry. They become curious places, places where it's safe to ask questions. And as individuals, we find that successful practitioners who disrupt poverty engage regularly in reflection on their both their beliefs, their values, and their beliefs and values and their practice. So as we think about creating a new normal, we've got to deal with an old normal problem, and that is that the inequities, as I said before, that we have seen a bright light shined upon are old. They existed before we closed school, and we have a chance now to actually go back and do something about those inequities. So I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm going to go with this, and give you some sort of take the theory down to land the plane and talk about some very concrete ideas that were provided to Bill and I when we circled back to the schools, principals of the schools that we had interviewed for our latest study. But before I do that, probably want to know a little bit about this study. So our second edition of Turning High Poverty Schools into High Performing Schools, as I said, just came out in April. In this edition, we studied 12 schools. 3 of those schools happen to be, one of those is in Idaho, one is in Montana, one is in Washington State. Some of those schools are rural. One of them in particular is fewer than 200 students, K-12. And what we did is we repeated a study we'd done 10 years ago. So there's a 10-year span between those 2 studies. We identified these schools across the country, first narrowing it down to 51 high-performing, high-poverty schools, and then down to 12 that were highlighted in the book. Out of what we learned, we created this what we call a framework for action. Today, because I don't have time, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but I want to point you to the blue gear. Leaders in these schools, and when I say leaders, I don't mean just administrators. Leaders and teachers and teacher leaders take action in 3 broad arenas. They build their internal capacity, what we call collective efficacy and leadership capacity, to be able to focus on learning, but just not just student learning, students learning, professionals in the building learning, the adults in the building, and the school actually learning, so system learning, to respond to those other 2 learning agendas. And the third area, they foster a healthy, safe, and supportive learning environment. So infrastructure, learning, and the learning environment. That's the way I'm going to talk about what we learned in terms of dealing with equity and inequity, both in school face-to-face models and out of school in this emergency learning time and in the event that we have to go to distance learning again. Here was our thinking. Our thinking was we knew these schools had a lot of capacity. We knew that they valued and committed to equity. And what we wanted to know is, how was their transition? Was their transition smoother than other schools' transition? What can we learn from schools that have a lot of capacity when something like this happens? And so we circled back to them, we interviewed them, and these were some of the things they told us. So in the area of building your internal capacity to actually ensure equity, they talked about the importance of all hands on deck. That the idea of responding to inequitable, whether it was grading practices or inequitable access to things, it couldn't just be left to the teachers, that it had to be a whole school, and in sometimes a whole school and community sort of endeavor. They also talked about the importance of supporting families to support their children. So focusing the family support in ways that would help families support their children. I want to talk about some of the specifics just-in-time activities that they talked about. So again, to support families to support their children, here's what they did and learned. So first, a lot of things to give kids access. That ranged from basic needs, and I'm sure many of your schools did this too, and you may have to do it again if you close, basic needs like lunch, like meals, technology. This is one of those areas that we really found great inequities in terms of both access to high school. And you know this because you in many places you live this in rural communities. Technology in terms of high-speed internet and devices. Schools also, loaned out musical instruments, they gave art supplies, they gave basic supplies, so lots of focus on access. They centralized some of their communication. One of the things they found is if, families had 3-4 children, and some of those children were at the secondary level and they had 4 or 5 teachers, that the sheer amount of communication that these families had to deal with was overwhelming. So thinking about centralizing communication and how can it be done? And you don't have to have a lot of high tech to do that. Some schools had, robust websites that people could do 2-way communications, but in other cases, they simply created a Google Doc with every teacher's name on it, and the parents could go right to that link to whatever teacher they needed to talk to. In another place, they talked about really centralizing one message home and then with a little customization as needed by individual teachers. The importance of 2-way communication. A lot of them talked about establishing two-way communication, old-fashioned phones, picking up the phone and making phone calls to families. They got really good about separating work that went home from the must do and the can do. So these are the important things, and these are the things that are optional. As they evolved, they talked about moving away from the idea that teachers are writing lesson plans and parents are somehow going to be able to follow them, that evolved into a much more home as a rich learning environment, providing free resources or ideas about free resources and very simple activities that families and kids could do together. In the area of fostering a healthy, safe, and supportive learning environment, all of them, every school talked about making the safety and well-being of their students, their families, their faculty, and their staff their first priority. They talked about ensuring students have equitable access to learning opportunities. So here's the tricky part with that. Many of these schools had to do both online, or offered both online and paper pencil packets. And making the paper pencil packet learning experience as rich as the online was a challenge. But they didn't just throw up their hands and say, we're not going to do this. They worked on making it a challenge, even making it richer, even if that meant they were doing teleeducation over a landline phone. And they troubleshooted, I'm not sure how you'd say that, low participation. Now, nationally, it's estimated that about half of the kids in the country did not log on or were not able to avail themselves to whatever distance learning opportunities were provided. So 50% of our kids not participating in a quarter of their schooling last year is going to have a long-term effect. In a high-performing, high-poverty school that has a lot of capacity, they're not going to let that go, and they didn't. And so there were many things that these schools did, and in fact, a lot of these schools ended up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% participation. So what did they do? They prioritized their relationships over academics. So it was first just making contact with kids, getting in contact with them. They often used protocols. Again, this was a place where they didn't leave it to everything up to an individual teacher, that there was a system, like it went from the teacher first contact to maybe a counselor if you have a counselor, to maybe an assistant principal if you have an assistant principal. But if it wasn't, it was the teacher to the principal. And then they were creative about multiple means, like which families really responded to things like Seesaw, or which text, or which is it a landline phone, or how can we best get a hold of our families? Now, lots of times in small and rural places, you know these families well, and you have a key advantage there. In some places, these folks had to make themselves small because they weren't small. And what I mean by that, they had to use things like homerooms and advisories to get the number of people that a single person had to contact and stay in contact with doable. They helped teachers prepare for the anxiety that they were bound to hear when they made contact with these parents. And they were careful about helping to not further marginalize kids. So one of the things that, that I've provided for you that you will be able to have access to in your breakout sessions is a list of resources. And a part of that list of resources is some articles and some podcasts that talk about the difficulties of requiring synchronous sessions. And I had not thought about this, and I mean, I really have thought a lot about how to respectfully work with families who live in poverty. And I wasn't sensitive to the idea that when we require kids to participate in synchronous and require them to use video, that we're actually maybe exposing those kids to a situation where they might be embarrassed by, they maybe don't have private spaces to be in, they maybe are feeling uncomfortable about letting us into their homes. So it's just something to be sensitive to. And one of the other things they talked about was leveraging relationships. Again, in your communities, it's quite possible that you have many of them, small and rural communities that we interviewed, that principals in those communities said, we know the families. We knew how to get a hold of them. We knew when a coach, an athletic coach had a relationship. We knew when the pastor had a relationship. We knew how to make contact. And in the end, these schools had a much higher participation rate than the national average would indicate. So in terms of equity in the learning experiences themselves, a lot of these places rethought their grading practices. In a part of that grading practices, they rethought their assessment practices and really focused on formative assessments versus summative assessments. And they addressed diverse learning needs. And in many cases actually, they talked about silver linings and their hope of being able to make what we're calling pedagogical lemonade when they get back to the brick and mortar schooling. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of those, addressing diverse learning needs. So one thing about a high-performing, high-poverty school is that they built the capacity when they were face-to-face to meet kids where they are. There's no other way that these schools could do what they do, which is, they beat the odds. So despite the fact that in our sample size, these schools had 65% or greater percentage of kids eligible for free and reduced meals. And in everything tested by that state, they beat the state average, and sometimes they beat the state average significantly. So differentiation was not something new to them. And when we asked them, what did you do when you went online? They said, we met kids where they were. A lot of them talked about doing special education and ELL instruction via some kind of small groups using things like Google Meets as an example. Some of them were already brainstorming and figuring out how to provide additional time. And some of that was through their universal design for learning models, and others were being able to monitor progress through at their advisory structures or their homeroom structures. In the case of one of the places that we interviewed, before the school closed, the school district closed actually, the superintendent asked for a vulnerable student list. I want a list of the most vulnerable students from every school, and I want those kids checked on every week. And so they just built a little structure inside that held themselves accountable for that. They repurposed partnerships, so after school programs became tutoring programs online to provide additional time. And as one principal said, we got smarter about what learning for what students at what time and why. So they evolved and got more and more strategic, even though they had a lot of capacity to do it in the beginning. So again, I want to stop here and take a minute to have you, so we won't take 3 minutes, but to have you again in the chat. What is it that you did to support families when you were in the quarantine time and schools were closed? Support families, or to troubleshoot low participation, or to address diverse learning needs? What was one thing in any one of those areas that you did, or your school did, or your district did? Hey, thank you so much for this participation. I can just see this is going to be a really great thing for you to be networked in your job alikes and to be able to share some of these ideas out as you think about this new time that you'll need to be so flexible in. I have just a few more things I want to share with you before we sort of launch you into your lunchtime and then your job alikes. And that is one of the most, I thought, positive and uplifting things that Bill and I discovered when we interviewed those principals about what their experience had been like was the number of silver linings that those principals talked about that they had found and seen in, you know, an otherwise really kind of horrible experience. And these are some of the things that they talked about. They talked about their intention to really capitalize on what had gone well and some of the things that they'd had to do during this time that they didn't actually do so well or enough of, that they were going to take back with them. And one of them was the ability to work together, to collaborate vertically and horizontally, the sharing of lessons, the sharing of videos, the sharing of lesson protocols, lots of collaboration. The peer support. Now they had a lot of peer support, but one of the things they talked about is there were teachers who they had worried about who ended up really thriving in this environment, and giving some time to think about what made this teacher thrive in that environment and how can I help this teacher thrive if you're a principal or a school administrator when we go back to school, so that he or she doesn't lose that, that energy that they got during this time. The importance of integrating social emotional learning really became so key, and the many ways that teachers did this was one of those silver linings they're going to bring back. The importance of student choice. And as they moved away from, you know, a very sort of, we're going to do lesson plans and parents are going to follow those, they talked about teachers working together across disciplines to create integrated units. They talked about place-based activities that they did in their communities, in their neighborhoods, that were family friendly, that were things that families were able to do in easier than the kinds of paper pencil packet things that have been going back and forth. And as one superintendent said, the idea of teaching and kids doing became more of giving kids experiences and challenges and then giving kids feedback on those things. So there were lots that came out of this time that these folks hope to bring back and keep in their brick and mortar experience. The need for just-in-time PD was one of those things, is that how do we keep that professional learning embedded in our schooling? So Hugh Vasquez is a senior associate at the National Equity Project, and he, in an article that I actually put in your resource list, titled, "What If We Don't Return to School as Usual," says this: "Nothing changes without disturbance. Since it's people who change things, that means change can't happen until people are disturbed. It is in this place of discomfort where we expand our beliefs and innovations are born. When we are disturbed, we change. Well, we've had a really big disturbance, and now we have a really big opportunity, and we have an opportunity to design a new normal and prepare for our reopening. And as we reopen, the way that we reopen and the way that we recover is going to shape public education for years to come. That's not my idea, that's Eric Tucker's idea. And again, this article, Preparing to Open, 6 Principles That Put Equity at the Core, is in your resources. As you move into your job alikes and you work with your sharing and your planning of next steps, here are some things to consider. Set the expectation that we've got to be flexible and we've got to be nimble. And in public education, we're not known for those two things: flexible and nimble. Think of planning not as one time, but as ongoing preparation. And survey your students, survey your teachers, survey your families to get to know really what was this like for them. Know their experience so that you can empathize if you don't already know it. And I suspect you folks know it because, again, in a rural community, you know people, and schools and communities are interdependent. Follow the data. Look at the kids that had the most success and the teachers that had the most success, and bring those bright spots back. Think about what made them successful. Bring that back, what worked, and leverage your rural assets. Leverage your smallness, leverage your relationships, leverage your caring communities. You're going to have a planning template, and it's going to be organized using the 3 things that I've talked about this morning: self-care, equity, and silver linings. And you'll have a set of things to think about. There'll be a set of questions for sort of leaders that have to do policy implementation. I know a lot of things are going to come down to you from state and state departments. And then there's a section for teachers, some questions to think about. So again, preparing to reopen, prioritizing self-care and well-being is going to be very important. How can you do that more differently or better than you have been? Building teachers' capacity to address trauma, better integration of social emotional learning, and developing an accurate understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on families right now. In that idea of preparing for the gap that you're likely to, you had achievement gaps before you closed, you're going to have bigger gaps, and you're going to have more kids with gaps. So minding the gap is going to be an important piece here, and that's going to be maybe one of your most important equity considerations. So again, we had to make fast planning on the fly when we closed before, but we have a chance now to actually be more systematic. And one of the principles' advice was this: plan for the most vulnerable, and everybody else's needs will be met. So thinking about some of your most vulnerable kids and plan for them. Building teachers' capacity to use diagnostic and formative assessments. A lot of you are probably doing that, but what can you do more, differently, or better? Building teachers' capacity to address learner variability. Determine what's essential to learn. We're going to go back and spend a bunch of time reviewing, because if we do, we're going to have a hard time catching up. Optimizing time. Bell to bell, that's one of the things that you just absolutely see in a high-performing, high-poverty school is the optimization of time and structures. Confront blaming families, challenge your mental map, empathize with families, and innovate to make parents and families an authentic partner. Some things to think about in sort of taking advantage of those silver linings. I've said a couple of these already. Seize the opportunity to rethink grading and assessment. This might be your chance to really break out of some inequitable grading policies. And there's several resources that I've provided. Leverage your rural assets and innovate again to make parents and families authentic partners in this process. Design thinking is a process that I think has its time has actually really come as we think about reopening our schools. And what I would call sort of your change cycle is really well aligned to the idea of design thinking. And again, when we're disturbed, we change. And the 2 pieces in the design thinking model that I hope you spend a lot of time thinking about are empathy for the people you serve, kids you serve, families you serve, and the rural community you serve. Empathy is your first place to go when you're designing, when you're setting your focus. And the other one is to think out of the box, to ideate, to brainstorm, to ask, as Hamish Brewer did, and this is your book that you've been given. In chapter 3, he says, do not forget the power of the question, why not? And that is key. That has absolutely been key to the success of high-performing, high-poverty schools. These are schools that move away from, well, that's the way we always did business, to asking, well, why is that the way we've always done business? And why can't we do it this way or that way? Why not? So a very important piece there. I'm going to close now, and I hope I have just a few minutes. I'm almost on time. I'd like to show you one more video. This is by the Jubilee Project. And actually, I think the Jubilee Project is a couple of guys with some video cameras. They take pictures, and this is what they hope to capture. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So let's take a look at this video.
That's what you're gonna ask her too?
That's a hard question.
Well, without teachers.
What would the world be like without teachers?
Chaos.
Sad, because I won't learn anything.
The younger generation wouldn't have anyone to look up to learn from.
Walk around ignorant.
I mean, we could keep the teachers, but just no homework. That'd be pretty cool.
Everybody would be going cuckoo and we wouldn't know anything.
I think that is the scariest thought that anyone could ever have.
I think it would be craziness just because I feel like teachers are, besides our parents, the first people we meet who like shape who we become.
I haven't always been like the best student throughout my whole life.
I was always in trouble.
I had suffered 3 Fs and I realized like, whoa, I need to fix that, you know?
4th grade was over. I'm here 5th grade, we graduate, 6th grade. Hey, Miss Gonzalez, how you doing? And then she's like, oh yeah, I heard these are your grades. What's going on in that science class? Like, she was like totally just keeping up. And I just felt like, whoa, like something's different about that.
Gave me the time of day, mostly. It was very, he was very engaged in stuff that I was doing. Even though I was in detention, I was still learning.
And she was the one teacher who really saw a lot in me to make me feel like I wasn't the kid that other teachers were saying.
And there was a point where I said, okay, I'm gonna fail my French class because I haven't been there, so I haven't done any homework, I'm just gonna drop out before I fail. And then she specifically came to me and said, no, I'm gonna work out a deal with you so that if you stay, you won't fail.
When you didn't do good at school, she would chew you out, but she would always give you a chance to make it up. You know what I mean? She would never put you low standard and just leave you there. You know, and that's one thing I like about teachers. You know, they won't leave you behind.
You know, and when I got accepted into colleges, the first thing I thought is like, I better go. And I better go and tell her I'm gonna be like, guess what? I got into Penn State, I got into a UC, I got into all these colleges.
Actually inspired me to pursue political science.
She's basically the one that taught me to just keep trying.
I can accomplish more than I probably think I can. I felt it, like she didn't have to do that, but it made the difference.
You see, I'm getting emotional, because like, she's great, you know? Give me a minute. I wouldn't be here without her, you know? And I'd like to thank her so much for that. Thanks, Mr. Victor, you know? Hope you see this, and I hope you know that you mean a lot to me, you know, you're really important. And yeah.
What was your teacher's name again?
Mr. Marable.
It's Mr. Elmore.
Shout out, Mr. Betterton.
Miss Harris.
Her name was Casey Crocker.
She just exhibited like such a raw passion for teaching. It made me want to teach. Like, I want to do that for people. Like, that's a beautiful thing. So yeah.
So I just want to thank you all for all that you do. And I think we just went through a time where it felt like we had a world without teachers, where families hopefully came to a new appreciation for what we do, what you do every day. And I just want to thank you for, actually, it's a huge privilege for me to be able to talk to you about some of these things that I've been learning in the last few months, and for me to have an opportunity to just thank you for what you do. So your task now is to answer the question, what kind of new normal will you build when you go back to your brick and mortar school? And again, thank you so much.